First, thank you for sitting to answer questions, and really appreciate you spending your time this way.
Well, it's my pleasure. Yeah, I think you are doing a great job, and I'm looking for great things from you.
Oh, thank you. Well, I can tell you that one thing about AABA's board, and I've been on AABA's board now, this is probably my 7th year, is that all the board members bring a real love for this organization that you built. A real love and appreciation for it, and I hope that comes across. We definitely try our best.
It shows, yeah. The programs are really spectacular and diverse, and people are enthusiastic.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
I'm glad to hear that. I'll let the board know.
Please do.
Michael, we've talked a little bit about where your family was from and where you grew up.
Mm-hmm.
Would you mind, and I know it was in Hawaii, but would you mind kind of describing where it was you grew up, and kind of what stands out for you in your time in Hawaii? I know it's a long time, but
well, it was a pretty ordinary childhood. The main thing I remember was that when I was in the kindergarten, my dad was in the Korean War. He's a Korean War veteran as a Army engineer. And when the war ended, and he was an officer, he got stationed to Japan. And actually, our family was able to join him in Japan. So I did my first grade in Japan.
No way.
On an Army base. And he was an officer, so we had some privileges and stuff. And
what city was that?
Kobe.
Oh, right.
Yeah. And I still remember a lot of stuff from that time, even though I was only in the first grade.
Wow, okay.
And have a real deep appreciation for Japan. And some very fond memories.
And so by the time your dad was stationed in Kobe, was that after the end of the Korean War?
Yes.
I see.
And then the next year, he got stationed in Stockton, California.
Right.
So the family then got sent over to Stockton, California, which was also very interesting and very different, and which I enjoyed. But my mom was not having any more of that. She said, "That's it, no more traveling." And so he was forced to leave the military at that point. We went back to Hawaii. And I spent my 3rd through 12th grades in Hawaii, in a very conventional kind of upbringing.
Oh, I see.
Uh-huh.
And so when so your dad joined the military, I take it, during the Korean War.
Yes.
And then after the Korean War, he stayed in service. And at least through one more relocation to Stockton, and then left the military after.
But he always loved the military, and so he stayed in the reserves.
Oh, I see.
To the point where he actually was able to retire with 20 years of service and draw a pension from that. And he was a lieutenant colonel when he retired.
Was the military his first career?
Well, no, actually not. His dad, my grandfather, was a builder, a contractor, and so my dad went into the wood making business, and he became a journeyman boat builder, which was kind of the most skilled of the woodworking trades. I can remember when we were growing up, he'd kind of build stuff every so often, like he'd build a stool. And then once he built a bird cage, just beautiful work there. Even as a kid, I could appreciate the craftsmanship. So he was a pretty amazing guy.
Wow. So he was a journeyman boat builder and still had enough interest in woodworking to build stuff at home.
Every so often he would, and he was very talented at it.
Yeah.
And then he went into the Federal Civil Service, and he eventually retired at essentially a super grade in the Federal Civil Service.
I see.
Worked in Washington, D.C. for a while as part of that.
Okay.
A very interesting person, very inspirational. I grew up with someone like that.
And was your dad originally from Hawaii?
Yeah, he was born and raised in Hawaii.
All right.
Right. His parents were from China.
Oh, okay.
And then on my mother's side, my grandmother was actually born in Hawaii. So I was a third generation Chinese American, actually,
Wow.
on my mother's side.
Right. Oh, okay. And so both sides of your family are from the mainland.
Guangdong. Yeah, right.
Okay.
Where most of the people who immigrated to the United States are from. Yeah.
Oh, I see.
Although from a different part of Guangdong than the people who immigrated to San Francisco.
I see.
Yeah.
And so the language of primary language before it came to Hawaii was Cantonese?
Right.
Yeah, okay.
Right.
Got it. And so when your dad was in the federal civil service and when he spent time in Washington, D.C., I have to imagine he was probably one of the first Asian Americans in whatever role that he happened to serve.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure how much of a pioneer he was, but he, in order to achieve one of those super grades, you kind of had to work in Washington for a while. And then also when he was in the reserves, in order to become a lieutenant colonel, he had to go to the War College in Washington, D.C. So I visited him there and spent a lot of time in Washington kind of looking at the museums and taking White House tours and so forth. It was very interesting.
Oh, I
very
see.
Inspiring, actually.
So was his civil service work, was that his career after the military then?
Yeah.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Basically, yeah.
Oh, got it. And what did he do before the military?
Well, he was pretty young. He was in high school. He was he actually went to private school, St. Louis High School in Hawaii.
Wow. Okay.
And then he was not a college graduate when he was in the service, but he went to night school at the University of Hawaii and eventually got his bachelor's degree, and so he became a college graduate, and he was always very good at both math and language. He was kind of strong in both areas. And
had your dad graduated from college at the time that he first joined the military?
No, he hadn't. But he was accepted as an officer.
Okay.
Anyway.
Oh, wonderful. And was your dad drafted?
I don't know. I honestly don't know. I can remember how traumatic it was because of my mom's reaction, of course, when he was told that he would be going to Korea. And my dad never talked about the experience in Korea because it was too horrible. It was just awful. People were being killed and being slaughtered there. And no one could draw that out of him.
Yeah. Well, I remember some of the stories from my dad when he was trying to keep his younger brothers, half-brothers, and sister fed and alive during the time of the war. He would, when he had occasion to go to school, he would go to school, and then on his way home, he would go to the creek to fish. I don't know if you call it fishing or hunting for frogs. But he said he was a prolific frog catcher. And so he would, catch these frogs and then string them on a wire down his belt so that he could take them home and grill them for his family.
Must have been a real treat for the family, and they must have needed it too. Actually.
Yeah.
Needed protein. Actually.
Yeah.
No, I think my dad saw a lot of horror in that war, and I give him a lot of credit for never talking about it. Never bragged about anything or anything like that.
Yeah. Well, that's quite a contrast from the generation we live in today, where there's a lot of sharing. Some might say oversharing.
Yeah. Well, it's true. Yeah. I'm not sure it's oversharing, but because if it promotes, activism and so forth, I think it's a good thing.
The Asian American experience in some respects in growing up in Hawaii is different than the Asian American experience in San Francisco today.
Very different.
And you went to college at Chow,
right.
I believe, and during a very tumultuous time
right.
In our country. And I have a friend in New York who commented on one of my video posts, and he talked about Stuart Quo and his time at UCLA, and how the APA movement to some degree was kind of came to life during that time period, and time period of upheaval and war, and wondering when you moved to the Bay Area, attended college at Cal, what the experience was, and why being involved in the APA movement was something that was appealing.
Well, I was interested in politics and knew something about the Hawaiian history in Hawaii and how the Hawaiians were mistreated, and the overthrow of the monarchy and so forth. But I didn't get a whole lot into that. I didn't know that much about the Asian American experience the Asian experience in America. The reason I went to Cal is that my sister, who was a year older than I, decided to go to Cal. I'd never heard of Cal. And this was 1964, and the free speech movement happened. And I would get this information about it, said, that sounds pretty cool, based on that, I decided that I wanted to go to Cal.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, because it was, and I was anti-war, anti-Vietnam War, and one of the first things I did when I got to Cal was join a march on the induction center. So I was definitely into what was happening during that period of time. And then gradually I learned more about the experience of Asian Americans. But, I grew up in a very different environment. Especially my family on my mother's side was very prosperous and prominent, both politically and economically. And so, I didn't feel disadvantaged or anything like that. And I didn't understand a lot of the stuff that was going on in San Francisco. So that was new to me, but very interesting and very compelling as I learned more and more about it. So Cal turned out to be the perfect place. I really enjoyed my experience there. And we were there in the series of the Vietnam War and the Third World movement and so forth, and we became active in the Asian Studies program at Cal and so forth. And so when I went to law school there, although that wasn't my first choice, but I ended up there. A lot of stuff started happening. Even though in our class we only had, I think, 5 or 6 Asian Americans out of a couple of hundred students.
Wow.
And the class before that, Dale Minami's class, only had about 5 or 6 Asians also. So, Asians were not really in the law at that point, and I didn't know any Asian lawyers in the so-called mainland. Although, for example, my mom had 3 brothers, and all of them eventually became lawyers. All 3 of them. And one of them became a very prominent judge in Hawaii. So I had very good role models for Asian Americans in the law.
Yeah.
But didn't quite understand why, initially why Asian Americans felt left out or why the Third World movement was important. But quickly, saw what was going on and wanted to be part of that.
I've heard something very similar from the father of one of my friends, Daniel Sakaguchi. He's also grew up in Oahu. Exactly. And came to the mainland, spent time in Los Angeles when he first encountered Asian Americans, and kind of that generation of experience, and related a similar story about how he didn't understand what kind of I'm paraphrasing, but the big deal was about the Asian American movement, right. And 9066 and its aftermath, and it just didn't resonate with him as much,
right.
Having grown in that environment. And yours is even for Asian Americans in Hawaii has to be unusual to have 2 uncles who practice law, one of whom becoming very prominent.
Yeah. Well, it was not only Chinese Americans, but I grew up with a lot of very close Japanese American friends, and they I think couldn't understand why the Japanese Americans in the mainland acted the way they did. They didn't appreciate the internment experience. And in fact, their attitude was, how did they allow themselves to be treated that way? And I heard lots of stories about how when the Japanese Americans from Hawaii were put together with the Japanese Americans from the mainland in like the 442 and so forth, they had a lot of conflicts initially.
Oh, I see.
But they, gradually learned each other's perspectives and appreciated and respected each other's perspectives. And of course, that became one of the most decorated, units of all time.
When you first went to Cal, one of the first things you did is join a march on an induction, military induction center.
Right.
And you had formed a view as to the Vietnam War by the time you went to college.
Yes.
At Cal. What was your father's reaction to your viewpoint, and did that cause strife in your family?
Oh, quite a bit. Yeah, he did not appreciate my point of view, and we had discussions about it, and we never really got together on it. And this is another thing too about Hawaii that was a problem for me, is that most of my relatives, Chinese relatives, were Republican and pretty conservative. So I was kind of out of step with them. And a lot of my cousins and so forth became lawyers as well.
I see.
And lawyers and judges. So, Hawaii, after a while, did not become that appealing to me, because I figured if I went back there, I'd have this, pressure to conform to become a Republican as well, and follow a certain established path.
Oh, I see.
That I wasn't interested in doing.
Yeah, and so when you first arrived in Cal, that was your first, one of your first experience joining that march, and you described how it wasn't immediately apparent to you, kind of the mainland version of the Asian American experience, and
exactly.
Kind of the third world movement.
Right.
But how did that come to reflect your viewpoint?
I'm sorry?
Yeah. So how did your viewpoint come to evolve over time as you?
Well, first of all, there was a third world movement that pretty much started in the Bay Area, or it really took off in the Bay Area, both at Cal and at San Francisco State, and then we had a series of strikes because of our interest in having the university implement the third world studies, and we went on strike to do those things, and then as we went into law school, that's when it really got very active, and then I started meeting some incredible lawyers. For example, that's when I went to law school, I met Joe Morizumi, and he was a huge influence on my thinking about Asians in America and what we needed to do to be included, and concepts of justice and equality and so forth, and inclusion.
Okay. Michael, one of the names you mentioned is Joe Morizumi.
Yes.
And Joe Morizumi is someone that you encountered in law school, and you mentioned that he's someone who shaped your thinking a great deal.
Absolutely.
I've heard of Joe's name primarily through AABA, but but I would appreciate learning a little bit more about how you came to encounter him and how he shaped your viewpoint.
Well, first of all, Joe was a wonderful human being. He was really warm, and he mentored a lot of people. You could always talk to him. He'd welcome you into his house. You'd sit around his dining room table and drink a lot of wine and do a lot of talking, and we'd work really hard. So we were fortunate to be exposed to him, because we didn't know that many Asian American attorneys in the Bay Area, because there weren't that many Asian American attorneys in the Bay Area, and he's one of the older ones. He and Ken Kawichi were probably the main practicing lawyers that we had contact with in law school when we were in law school. And we're talking about like Dale and Eugene Tomine and people like that. So eventually he was involved in, for example, some of the social activism, non-Asian American social activism strikes at Cal, and represented people who were being charged with crimes because of their participation in demonstrations. So we started doing criminal cases, and then we sort of switched gears and started getting involved in anti-war type activities. And Dale and Eugene Tomine and I did draft counseling. So after a while, we started filing federal cases on behalf of draftees as well as service people who were trying to get out of the service, mainly who were conscientious objectors once they learned that they would have to fight in a war. So we would file a lot of petitions in federal court on behalf of our clients. Joe was the only licensed lawyer, but we did a lot of the paperwork and so forth, and then we'd file them and he'd argue them, and we were fortunate to really we filed a lot of cases. I'm not sure how many, but and we won all of them except for one.
Wow.
We appealed that case, and by the time I was admitted to the bar, the case had progressed to where it was ready for oral argument. And so Joe said, "Hey, Mike, you wrote the briefs and everything. Why don't you argue this?" And so I said, "Okay, sure, why not?" I thought, well, if he thinks so, I'll do it. So one of the first things I did was to try and find other older lawyers, Asian American lawyers, to find out, well, how does this work? What's your experience and what should I think about? And I found out that no one had argued a case in the Ninth Circuit before, and there weren't that many lawyers anyway to pick from.
No one from the community, or
from the Asian American bar had ever argued a Ninth Circuit case. But we had a great team. I mean, for example, Dale, Eugene, and I were kind of the worked together on preparing the pleadings and the briefs, so we'd all get together and kind of brainstorm about the cases, and then Dale would have the responsibility of doing the first draft. So he'd get all of these legal tablets and things, and he would write these pages and pages of beautiful prose and everything else. Eugene's responsibility was finding cases to plug in, and my responsibility is to edit all those things, so to fit the cases in with the Dale's prose. So it was a great team, and everybody, he came up with pretty good results.
Everyone do their homework?
Everyone did their homework. Everyone had to know what they were doing, but they had their areas of specialization and things. So it was a successful collaboration.
And how was your experience arguing in the Ninth Circuit?
Actually won unanimously in a published opinion.
Wow.
And it was during those days where in the published opinion they would indicate Joe Morizumi as a lawyer, and then they say argued Michael G. W. Lee. So we'll always have that.
Wow, that has to have been very, very early in your legal career.
The argument came up within 6 months of being admitted to the bar.
That's a nice start. That's a nice entree to the bar.
It was pretty heady and obviously very enjoyable. But doing that with Joe was terrific. He was such a wonderful mentor to us.
I think you mentioned that when you went to law school at Cal that there were only 5 or 6 Asian Americans in your class, and maybe a similar number, 5 in the prior class.
Right.
In your class, who else was there? Susan
Tamura, who is the daughter of a very prominent appellate judge, Judge Tamura from Los Angeles. Neil Gotanda, who is a well-known lawyer and an activist. Let's see, Eugene Tomine, and there are not that many people, but I'm kind of running out of names. But very interesting people to work with and to get to know.
But AABA has a lot more members than I can know in person nowadays, but one name stands out, which is Derek Tomine.
Yeah.
Is he related to Eugene?
Oh, yeah. Eugene's son. Oh. Absolutely, yeah.
That's great to see.
Yeah. Terrific young lawyer, really terrific young lawyer, yeah. But we, and one of the things that we did immediately was to get involved in the affirmative action program and started to assist in with evaluating applications and urging the admission of Asian Americans. And so by the time that we graduated, the numbers in the entering class was up to around 25.
Wow! And
it continued at that level from then on. So it was a very different class, even in those 3 years. And wonderful new lawyers and things. Of course, nothing like today. I mean, I go to an AABA event, and there are so many smart, engaging, talented people around there. It's just wonderful to see. It's just so inspiring.
One of the things that may not be as apparent to the younger attorneys and law students is how Asian Americans did benefit from affirmative action in at least the 70s.
Sure.
And and I had this conversation with Stuart. But looking at it from the perspective of recent Chinese immigrants who don't have that background. I mean, but it's also understandable that they may not relate, even if they knew that history and background. And one of the questions I asked Stuart, and curious to hear your perspective, is how to kind of relate that history of exclusion to new generations of immigrants who, not rightly or wrongly, just is not their experience.
Well, I think that the things that Dale Minami and Don Tamaki are doing is the kind of things that probably should be presented to more people. And I'm really proud and thrilled that they're taking on that responsibility, because that's all you need to do is learn that history, and especially in this age of Trump, I would think that there'd be there's a feeling of that this is important, that this is compelling. We need to do this stuff, and I think our younger generations, even though they're more privileged and so forth, can relate to that. Absolutely can relate to that. And Dale and Don are doing such a good job of bringing that kind of information out and getting the word out in different environments and so forth, including movies and speeches and so forth. Mm-hmm. So they're essentially devoting their lives to that, and it's fantastic. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I think that they definitely are striking a chord among younger people as well. And they're trying to go into the schools, and
right.
And not trying to upset kids or anything like that, but to give them a realistic look at this is our history and this is what happened to us, and let's make sure it doesn't happen again. Because we didn't think it was going to happen to us back then either.
Yeah, I'm amazed to see some of the actions unfold in front of my very eyes. Oh. And 2 years ago, if you told me that Cambodians and Vietnamese would be singled out and deported for crimes that they've already served time for,
I wouldn't
have believed it.
Right. and they have clean records, they have families, they have good jobs, they've been productive, tax-paying citizens, role models, and so forth. Yeah, and the immigration service is choosing to deport them now. Yeah, that's just awful.
When you graduated from law school, within 6 months you had a successful oral argument in the Ninth Circuit. You were one of the founding fathers of the Asian American Bar Association. I wonder, can you describe what the experience was like for you as a newly practicing attorney, and what motivated you to try to coalesce the community into a bar association?
Well, it wasn't hard to find reasons to want to do that. All of us old-timers have a few horror stories about our experiences in court, for example, where we were mistreated and actually treated in a very racist way, and our clients, because we didn't have any critical mass. People had rarely seen Asian Americans in the courts, except as defendants, and there were very few judges. So we'd go in there and it'd be an old boys kind of network, and then there was us. And like I said, I think everybody has their horror stories to talk about that. So that was a huge motivation to be included and to be respected, and to properly represent our clients, who were ultimately the victims of that type of treatment and attitudes. No, we knew there's a lot of work to be done, and we felt it was very compelling for us to take it on and do it. And people like Joe, who had such a intense sense of justice and injustice, and spoke so eloquently about it to us. We were basically fired up, and to Dale's credit and Don's credit and people like that, they're still fired up. And it's wonderful to see. It really is very inspirational.
Are there any stories or experiences that stand out for you in those early days of your practice where either your client or you were treated unfairly, let's say?
Well, some of it, it's hard to. I mean, I wasn't ever called any names or anything like that, but I was definitely not one of the crowd. And I definitely didn't get any preferences and so forth, which is very different from what happens today. I think we're treated, and our clients are treated with much more respect and deference and so forth. And we can even be part of the old boys network, although that's maybe not the best thing, but at least our clients are not being mistreated the way they are. And a lot of that has to do, for example, with the number of Asian American judges. You've just had that big celebration of APA judges, and I'd be remiss not to mention at some point Dale's incredible contribution to that effort. He has almost, in some ways, single-handedly been responsible for changing the judiciary in California as far as Asian American judge appointments is concerned, and identifying and getting really good people appointed to the bench in both the state and the federal level, and really good people. So you go into court now, and you've got a critical mass of Asian American attorneys, and you've also got a critical mass of Asian American judges. It makes a huge difference, and a lot of that we have Dale to thank for. Even though sometimes we kid him about his godfather-like role and so forth, but it's not an exaggeration. He has really put a lot into it and had a profound influence and effect on that. Dale does relate a story about how the organization AABA was one of two nascent organizations at the time serving APA legal community. One was based in Chinatown, Jack Chow, and there was your group, and somehow the two groups decided to join forces and
work together.
Right.
Can you tell us about those early days?
Yeah. Those are great times, actually, and a lot of it started. And I was fortunate to be in the middle of it, but that was just a matter of luck. No talent or anything like that. But I started with the Asian Law Caucus with people like Dale and Ken Kawiichi and Eugene Tomine. And about a year into the Asian Law Caucus, out of the blue, I got a job offer from lawyer Clarence Moy, who was managing attorney of the Chinatown office of the San Francisco Neighborhood Legal Aid Association Foundation, or SNFLAF we used to call it. And I just couldn't turn it down. It was just too compelling. So I moved over to San Francisco to work at SNFLAF. And at that time, we had a small group of Asian American attorneys in the East Bay who were getting together and saying, we should have a bar association. And really to push the kind of social issues that caused us to become lawyers in the first place. I mean, not necessarily for economic reasons or anything like that. And then when I went over to SNFLAF, I started meeting more and more San Francisco attorneys, although there weren't that many, and then found out that there was another small group of San Francisco attorneys talking about starting a San Francisco Bar Association of Asian Americans. So, one thing led to another, and we started meeting together in a very congenial way. The de facto head or leader of the San Francisco group was a lawyer by the name of Chow, who was much older than us and quite prominent. But best of all, he owned a very popular Chinese restaurant in San Francisco Chinatown, which we naturally started making our meeting place. The two groups would get together with free drinks all around, and ultimately, got to know each other well enough. So we decided, maybe we should do something together here. And so Dale got the bylaws of the Chinese American Bar Association of Los Angeles.
Scala.
Yeah, right. And borrowed it and inserted AABA's name into in place of the Southern California group, and eventually our entire expanded group adopted those bylaws, and it's still the template for what the structure of the AABA is today. I mean, the officer structure, the board structure, and so forth. A lot of the same committees, major committees, but AABA is so expanded now, and so it's in numbers and activities and everything else. But it was a good template. And one of the things that we did to encourage the legitimacy and the scope of this now Greater Bay Area Bar Association is Dale and I actively promoted having Chow be the founding president of the organization, which so everyone could buy into. And then at the second time around, I became the second president, and Dale was the secretary. And I think if you look at the role of the officers and directors after that, it really is very representative of all aspects of our bar in terms of gender and age and practice area and so forth. And we made a real deliberate effort to do that. And the different thing about that bar too is that at the time, all of the bars were divided into ethnic Asians. There was a Chinese American bar, the Japanese American bar down in Southern California. But to us, it was kind of a no-brainer that we should be inclusive of all of the Asian American groups. I mean, we had grown up in the third world strikes where we were all united. A lot of us came from Hawaii, or some of us came from Hawaii, and we had plenty of role models of both Chinese and Japanese people who were prominent and were successful politically and economically. And then people like Dale, who came from Southern California, had many great role models of Chinese and Japanese people, and had a lot of contact with the various Asian necessities. So to us, it was kind of a no-brainer to have an umbrella organization. And the other thing, of course, is that we knew we didn't have critical mass. Even the joint group, the numbers were not there, and it was hard to have real credibility based on if we started dividing up like that. So you're so fortunate to have what you have. I mean, it's that great umbrella group. Not to say that it's not a bad thing to have, it's not a bad thing to have separate bar associations, but we should be together as well.
I agree, and I observe the different paths that urban bar associations, affinity bars take when they form umbrella or Pan-Asian groups versus when they start out as ethnic-specific groups, like Los Angeles.
Right.
Los Angeles, about 2 decades ago, unified into AABA Los Angeles, and has, in my view, very similar and kind of wonderful programming and an advocacy focus through the work, and are able to accomplish things as a group that it may be a little more difficult. Well, one of the things that I'm curious about is in forming a Pan-Asian group, I have to imagine that there were different things that could have pulled the organization apart, right? You mentioned one is perhaps generational. Jack Chow was established, well-known, Chinatown focused, had his community there, was established, had his own restaurant. And then there were the ALC folks, and they had maybe a more activist or progressive focus. And there were different, also different ethnic tensions, right? Can you describe what it was that led you all to kind of be able to hold it all together despite the potential for splintering? Well,
the values were always there, the shared values, and a lot of us had been through the third world stuff together, and people like Ron Kitachai over at San Francisco State, who's become a very prominent judge in San Francisco. These are all of our friends, and we shared those principles, and so we all had the attitude that it made us stronger to be together and not apart. And we made a deliberate effort to always try and reach out and involve everybody and give everybody exposure and so forth. And the other thing that Dale talks about is, in kind of a joking way, but we partied a lot. An unintended consequence and gift of this organization, this new organization, was all these incredible, strong, lasting, real friendships that we made.
And some marriages.
What's that?
And some marriages.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. And so Dale refers to it as partying and a lot of hard partying and things, but we became fast friends, and it's a wonderful organization to meet people and to form that type of relationship. Yeah.
I know that when you became president of the Bar Association of San Francisco, you were really blazing a trail. And I just wonder would you mind kind of describing what that process was like to eventually fill that role, and what it was like when you were actually there?
Well, it was exciting. It was hard work. It was a lot of time, but it was a blast. And the Bar Association of San Francisco, I don't need to tell you, is just a wonderful organization. The values, the lawyers who are involved, the leadership, the staff work and everything, just tremendous. You can't get a classier, better organization, even way back then. If anything, the only real problem I had with it is you went to the boardroom and you had all the pictures of all the past presidents, and there were a whole bunch of old white men, And that was wrong. So, and I'm not even sure how I even got into the chairs and so forth. Every so often, I was in the room and I saw your picture in there, and you were so out of place, And so one of the, they give you a poem when you become president. And so my poem says something that in the first Asian American president in the 108-year history, and actually they could have said first non-white president in the 108-year president. And I would look at that and I say, is that something that we should be celebrating or decry? That's a pretty bad record.
Probably both.
Yeah, right. So it wasn't a totally happy thought to put out there, but I was really proud to do that, and I'm really happy that there are other people. And Doris is the president this year, and like I said, I think they're
third Asian American president.
Right. And of course.
Joan Hartani.
Yeah, Joan. Joan did a wonderful job, and continues to do a wonderful job, in bar politics and so forth. Yeah. So we've had some great representatives, I think, and we'll continue to do that.
Well,
but we've got to get more, get more in the pipeline. Absolutely.
Well, a couple stories come to mind for me. One is when I interviewed Justice Ming Chin, he said that when he first joined the bench, he did it at your urging. He said, well, I got a call from my friend Michael Lee, and he said, even if you don't want to do it, you got to take one for the team. And the other story that comes to mind for me is Joan, when she was president, I think she gave an interview in San Francisco Magazine. I think this is what it was. It was a long time ago, where she said that it was Kamala Harris that tapped her on the shoulder and said, hey, you got to join. So it was either that or an interview I did at Joan several years ago, one of those two sources. But, I wonder when you were on the board and then eventually became president, whether it was either or were both of those phenomena where either someone tapped you on the shoulder and said, hey, it's about time, or whether you, in your mind, thought, I got to take one for the team.
Well, it never crossed my mind, to aspire to be president of the bar. I mean, it was a lot of work, a lot of time, and so forth. It was interesting. The story I heard, and I didn't hear this until fairly recently, when I had lunch with Drew Ramey, and she said, the way you got into the chairs is that Hoyt came into my office and says, you got to put Mike Lee into the chairs, And she says, "Oh, okay. You don't say no to Hoyt. He's a pretty powerful presence." And so Hoyt had everything to do with that. He's a relative newcomer in town and a very brash young man, and he just put it out there. And Drew has a tremendous amount of experience and influence with the bar. So that's how that happened. But what Ming says is actually true. Dale and a lot of us recognize the need for Asian American judges, and we never aspire to be judges for whatever reason. So we looked around originally when we started the caucus, and it's like, Ken, you've been practicing for a while. You got to be a judge, And then Ken goes, oh. So we really pushed in. We made phone calls and did the usual stuff that you go through. And at some point, it actually looked like he was going to get appointed. We were getting back the feedback, and Dale was really the point person in all this. He's got a real talent for that. And I remember being with Dale and Ken, and Ken says, I don't really want to be a judge. Wait a minute, Ken. You're going to get appointed. You got to do this. And so he was actually kind of backed into that kind of reluctantly. And we looked around also for people like experienced people. And there weren't that many senior Asian American attorneys who had the qualifications. And Ming was the perfect candidate. He had such a profile and such a wonderful attorney. And so his first reaction was, "Oh, I don't know about that," And then we pestered him and so forth. And he finally came around and he said, "Okay, but I have $1 million case, and I have to finish that first." And so he did. He finished his $1 million case, which is the high point, one high point of his very successful career as a lawyer, and then he took the appointment. So it was a very good story. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad that there are some people who are willing to do it.
Well, it is a sacrifice. It was a sacrifice. I mean, both Ken and Ming were very successful lawyers, and they enjoyed it. It's great being a lawyer. I'm not sure that I do pro tem work. I've done pro tem work for many, many years, and I enjoy it. But I mainly do it because it gives me a different perspective. When I think about arguments that I'm going to make, I think about, okay, when I was pro temping and they made that argument, I wasn't buying that. It's good to get a reality check that way.
Would you mind talking a little bit about I forget the acronym that you used, but it was in San Francisco was the kind of the legal center that you got the job offer from.
SNFLAF, yeah.
SNFLAF?
Yeah, SNFLAF, the San Francisco Neighborhood Legal Assistance Foundation. It was a legal services corporation entity, and they had I think about 5 neighborhood offices in Central City, Mission. That was the Mission office. They had a downtown office, and Chinatown had one of the offices.
Michael, in your career, you've done a wide variety of work, including in your pro bono and private practice, criminal law, immigration, civil law, and I was wondering, one of the threads that pops out for me in looking at your background is how much you devote towards the kind of the public aspect of your law. There's a public interest aspect thread really since law school to the present day. One of my favorite professors, leadership professor, who talked about as a leader the need to reconcile and balance ambition versus aspiration, and the aspiration part being the desire to do good for other people. Wondering what it was, if you can identify, that animated you, motivated you to contribute so much of your life to doing public interest work.
I think that I start at a point where public service, to me, is a duty and an obligation that we all have to undertake. And I enjoy doing it as well, but I need to do it. And it's proven to be something where I've met so many good people. And when you do good, you feel good. It makes everyone better. It makes my kids proud of me from time to time, and if that happens, then and look at what the benefits I've gotten out of, and I consider doing the bar association stuff and the caucus and everything, and part of the public service really. Met some incredible people, giants and geniuses of the legal profession. It's been a total positive thing. If I I don't think that I'm particularly special about anything, but I've been very lucky to be at the right place at the right time. But it's really paid off as far as experiencing really wonderful experiences, meeting people like Joe Morizumi and again Dale Minami and Ken Kawiichi and Don Tamaki, and it's so inspiring. And everyone should do it. Absolutely.
One of the questions I had the opportunity to ask Jason Lee, the second APA president of the State Bar, is about public service work. And he's, in my mind, made public service work a central part of what he does. A lot of, I think it's fair to say that a lot of minorities, and probably Asian Americans in particular, avoid public service for whatever reason. And wondering for those young attorneys who might be reluctant to spend their time that way in public service, even giving back to bar associations and other community work. What would you say about why it's important to do so?
Well, it's always important to do good and to lift other people and push important issues and so forth. But I think it feels good. I think it gives you perspective on life. You become a role model for your kids, for example, and that's so important. In some ways, it's almost in my blood. My dad was always like the PTA president and always, being in charge of different things. And that also inspired me. I was very proud to, see him doing all those things and kind of amazed because I knew how busy and preoccupied he was, but he still made time to do those things. And like I said, when you do good, you feel good, and it makes everyone better around you.
Your family goes back on your mother's side for generations, 3 generations, I think you said. In Hawaii.
In Hawaii, yeah.
And your dad goes back a couple of generations.
Right.
And your mother's brothers engaged in law, and I think you said there are people in your family who've engaged in public life, in the sense that they've engaged in political life, and you had that interest yourself. Can you tell us about that background? How you or your family have engaged in, kind of political life.
Well, I don't know all the details, unfortunately, because when I was younger, I didn't ask enough questions that I wish I had. But especially my family on my mother's side was always very politically active, mainly on the Republican side, and I have at least half a dozen relatives who have been judges and so forth. So they've gotten judicial appointments that way. In fact, my uncle, my mother's brother, had 7 kids, and 3 of them became lawyers.
Wow.
Yeah. And all of them have, and one of my other mother's brothers had a son who became a lawyer and a judge as well. Mm-hmm. So I've got other cousins like that. So it's always been kind of in our blood, and people have to be politically active in order to achieve those things. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's always been around.
Oh, got it.
Yeah.
And if you don't mind if I ask you a non-career question.
Okay, sure, absolutely.
You made me smile when you talked about how it's important to make your kids proud of you from time to time. I wonder, having raised 2 grown children now, daughter and a son, Chase, kind of looking back, what were those parenting lessons that you would have told a younger Michael G.W. Lee?
The best things that I ever did in my life is to have my children, and it continues to be the joy of my life. So they bring so much to me, and to make them happy, to make them proud is pretty much what I live for. Unfortunately, that also made me a pretty permissive parent, more like a grandparent. Because my approach has always been kind of unconditional love. But I was a pretty old dad. My oldest, my daughter, was born when I was 42 years old.
Oh, similar to me.
Oh yeah, okay. So then you know how much you appreciate it. It's kind of a even bigger gift at that point. And to see her grow up and to be able to spend the time. But it was hard. For example, my daughter was born in January when I was just starting my year as president of the San Francisco Bar. So if you can imagine it, I didn't take a break from my practice. So it was kind of around the clock, but it was just pure joy. It was it was a crazy time, but it was just wonderful, and it's continued to be that way. So you're a lucky guy that you're starting off on that, and I can tell that how wonderful and rewarding it is.
Very much so. And one, I can say the downside is that when I lift my 2-year-old toddler above my head, I feel those aches and pains. But on the positive side, as an older parent, you're more settled. I'm not moving from town to town as we did as children, and struggling to figure out who I am.
Right.
Those days are behind you.
Right.
So you're in some respects a more stable parent, or at least in my experience.
Well, and then there'll become a time that you'll, unfortunately, before you know it, is that they'll leave home. And I've never gotten used to the empty nest thing. I still hate it. I want them to come home, and both of them are gone. My daughter lives in Los Angeles. My son's traveling the world. But they've grown up to be terrific people, and I do want to continue to make them proud.
I realize that we've left massive decades of your career out through this questioning, and we've jumped around, and I apologize for that.
No.
But looking back in your career, what are some of the moments that stand out for you as, gosh, I'm really proud of that, or proud or not, this was such a memorable experience for me?
There's so many of them, and I have to just look at the most recent ones. I feel prouder and prouder all the time. Dale's fellowship dinner the other night. And, you get up there and you listen to him. Hoyt Zia, who's another close friend, and his sister just came out with a book, and he was part of the presentation of that book. And when I go to bar association AABA stuff, to see the kind of leaders like you that are there that are going to make AABA even better, it makes me so proud. So it's hard to single out any one thing, but it keeps happening, and that's why I keep going to the meetings and things. It's always inspirational, I'm glad to have people like you there willing to make the sacrifices, because they're definitely sacrifice.
Well, one thing Dale told me is that if I tried to feature you in any way, that you would reject the attention and recognition. But we appreciate you and appreciate your service.
Well, I'm realistic. I'm nothing special. I was at the right place at the right time. I'm very lucky, and I got to meet so many wonderful people and observe them in action, and the positive impact they've had on our legal system and on Asian Americans in the law. It's been a wonderful, wonderful ride, and I've been privileged to be have been a small part of it. And for a tiny little bit there in the beginning, I had a place in the sun, and then I feel like I was honored to play a supportive role and to watch these spectacular legal leaders, do their thing, like Dale and Don, and continue to do it. And I'm just always amazed. They haven't slowed down at all.
Well, one thing that you're, leaving out of that equation is how difficult it is to, to start a lasting institution and to kind of help it through its troubled times. And, I've been around AABA enough to know that, like any institution, it's had its ups and downs, but it takes a lot of effort and love and attention to help it survive and thrive in its now 43rd year.
Right. Well, I mean, everybody recognizes its importance and is devoted to its continued success. And that's so it's not personal in that respect, and it's, the organization comes first, the profession comes first, and the good that we can do comes first.
I observe that we live in times where the perspectives are so polarized, and one can point fingers at which side started it first and how we got to this point where we are so polarized as a country, where we really do seem to be, in some respects, talking past one another. But one thing I appreciate, and I try to remind myself about APA bar organizations, is that Republican or Democrat, left or right, conservative or progressive, some thread of our experience led us to this common time and a common place where we can kind of come together in fellowship, and then even if we don't see eye to eye on our, let's say, on our political viewpoints, that we support one another in kind of the expression of our lives. You know what I mean?
Totally agree. And I think that's kind of been the cornerstone of AABA, the way we've developed it and try to include everybody, even though we may disagree with them politically, or we belong to different parties and so forth. Ming is a good example. He was a Republican. He'd been a Republican the whole time. We supported him as strongly as any Democrat. We recognized the value and his excellence and everything else, and that was what was important to us.
AABA has been around now for 43 years, kind of depending on how you count it. Looking forward, what would you want for the organization, and how would you want it to evolve? I used to ask the question in terms of the next 40 years, but that seems very long. But just looking forward, what would you want for the organization? How would you want us to evolve?
Well, I think in part it's looking forward and trying to predict the future, but in part it's looking backwards. And I think to begin with, I think what you're doing makes a whole lot of sense. I mean, I could constantly put people like Dale and Don up there because they're still they still have the values, they still have the passion, they still have the ideas that we should be following. And I think that AABA should reflect their ideals and their ideas and their passion. And of course there are other practitioners or members of the legal community, like the Harry Lowe's and the Lillian Singhs and so forth, that we need to keep listening to. Real giants and people of wisdom. Going forward, I can't predict. I mean, I think that we have some basic values. We're talking about, we've always talked about inclusion. We've always, and this includes like minorities, gender inclusion, marginalized communities and so forth. We've always talked about professional development. And I know AABA now has great educational programs and also historical celebration of historical events and so forth. So it was so much to choose from that it's hard for me to predict where we're headed and so forth. The immediate future to me is all of the challenges that Trump is raising for us. We've got to get back to the political norms that we established so many years, and the values that we share, whether we're Republicans or Democrats. So we've got to get rid of that scourge, really. So it's hard for me to give a more long-term type of response than that. I think that you're on the right track. I think that the kind of leadership that you're providing and your group the leadership group is providing is just excellent. Yeah, I think you're absolutely at the right track.
Yeah, I'm very proud of my board, and that was part of the reason for the long-term strategic plan, is that we have to decide as a board what how we want the organization to evolve.
You have an abundance of superstars. It's very impressive. I can't wait to see how this all plays out. It's going to be great.
I'm very proud of my board.
Right.
I wasn't living in California at the time, but observing a couple of decades ago when California was about to become a majority-minority state. That's in the past 2 years, that's the example that's come to mind for me. And again, observing as an outsider, not living here, but seeing the xenophobic, I think it's fair to say, kind of anti-immigrant, proposed laws and ballot propositions that happened in California at that time.
Right.
And you fast forward now 2 decades later, and California is quite a different place, for better or for worse. But with respect to inclusion, I think far better.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's what gives me optimism for our conversation nationally, which is to recall that while this is a odd point in time, it's not the first time we've been here, and it's not the first time we as Californians have been here, and so I have to hope that once the scapegoating and the fear dies down, people will have a more constructive conversation.
Let's hope so. Yeah, I think we're kind of going in the right direction. How we're shaping up for the immediate future, the next 2 years. I like the direction, but we'll see.
Yeah,
but
I try
California is definitely not the United States, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And what also occurs to me, and that's one of the things I love about the national organization, is that you see communities at such, with respect to APAs and inclusion, you see communities at so many different points along the temporal spectrum. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
And so, when growing up in Michigan, seeing, one other Asian American in my town, my sister, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not by much. And then to think to your experience, where your mother goes back generations, and you've had uncles who are prominent lawyers and political leaders. That's amazing. It's amazing to me. And then to think that we find it meaningful enough to coalesce under this identity, hyphenated identity of Asian American, given all those very disparate places in time that one finds oneself in this country.
Right.
It's pretty remarkable.
Well, and also we've been talking about Asian American organizations and so forth, but a lot of what you see on the resume and everything is including us in other things, and participating in other things, participating in the bar, participating in the ABA. Even when I teach at Stanford, it's kind of a drag to drive, all the way to Palo Alto from Berkeley and so forth. But I think it's important for them to see Asian Americans, these incredibly talented and smart and to be successful lawyers, to have interacted with some Asian American lawyers. I think that's important.
Is that what motivates you to drive the hour plus from San Francisco?
Some of it is, some of it is. And some of it is just to interact with these incredibly smart, talented lawyers. It's so inspirational, and so gives me such hope for the future. And it's funny because my kids are always, you have to prepare for these classes. And I'm always preparing and complaining, and my kid says, he says, Dad, you complain like crazy every year, but then every year you keep going back. He says, why do you keep doing this? And I said, the students are amazing. They are really amazing. But in addition to that, it's important for them to see Asian Americans, because they're going to be future leaders, and and have people, make impact on our profession.
I think I went through that advocacy skills course that you taught, but it was after you started teaching it. I would have loved to have seen an Asian American teacher of that program. It was just not in my mind, to be honest, that an Asian American could be a trial lawyer.
Well, it was so much fun. For example, the last time I taught one of the sections that I taught along with, not Donna, but
Sally?
Yeah, Sally.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Sally Kim. She was terrific, and I thought we made such a good team. But it was like one of those things. Wow, this is great. We're two Asian Americans that were teaching this class
great.
at Stanford, and having a great time and really interacting well with the students.
Michael, looking back on your life and your career and your family and all the various work opportunities and experiences that you've had, and I understand this is totally unfair and broad question, what makes for a meaningful life?
Wow, I think relationships, absolutely relationships. I mean, it's wonderful to have participated in some of these groups and you've got some accolades and some positive feedback and so forth, but it's relationships. And of course it starts with family, your family relationships. And then, again, one of the unintended consequences of even all the involvement that we've talked about with the bar associations and the Asian American Bar Association is the friendships, lasting, deep, compelling friendships that we've had. It's the most important thing. Absolutely. And I'm glad I'm getting to know, for example, you. Otherwise, I would not have probably had many conversations with you.
So I was so happy you were willing to come and sit for a conversation.
Oh, I'm always, I told you before that just let me know if I can help out, and I mean it, and I continue to, extend that. If anything I can do, I think you're doing a fantastic job, and I really look forward to, seeing all the good things that happen as a result. I want to be helpful. What you do and the results of what you do was what makes me happy. And going to these again, I go to these functions in the AABA, and I also already have my ticket to the gala. Gala.
Oh, great.
And I'm really looking forward to it. And I run into Dale and all the other people, and we keep saying, "Wow, look at these people." In jest, we say, they're so much smarter and better looking than us. How did we ever start this thing off? They've taken it and made it into something amazing.
About a year ago, I had the occasion to interview Hoyt, and talk about his time in the organization and his time starting the AABA and also ABC back then. And he said that as someone who started these bar organizations, he hoped that his hope in starting them was that these affinity groups wouldn't be necessary. And mentioned that story to Holly Fujia, and she said the same thing, which is that it would be ideal if these were just social organizations, and the social part definitely important. But I feel like as one of the animating things about this organization that I love, and I hope that it never loses track of, is the fact that it exists for a purpose. And that purpose is to make things better. Yeah,
and there's still a need. There's absolutely still a need. Now, if someday there is no need, and it's possible, then fine. But there's definitely a need right now. And and having people like you there to carry the torch is terrific. It gives me a lot of confidence, and that things are going to be good. But I still think that the organization, its values and what it does and so forth should reflect some of the real giants of the profession who are still involved, like Dale and Don Tamaki. Their values, their passion, and everything else really should be kind of our shining light.
All right. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Appreciate it very much.
So do I. My pleasure.